If you're a regular on the channel, you might have noticed I'm putting out less content than normal. It's not because it's by design. I actually have plenty of stuff I want to talk about, but I am feeling very weird. And I'm still not feeling good right now, but I guess I'm feeling good enough to try and give this a go. But I'm not sure what's wrong with me, but I'm having like bouts of vertigo. Just really strange stuff. So if I'm a little less animated or zoned in, dialed in on this video, you know why? Because I feel very, very strange, probably just as strange as DC Comics feel these days, as their sales data and trends just kind of bottom out and hit just really a terrifying new low these past few months. Numbers that we hadn't seen. We'd seen interest in DC Comics go down and down and down. And I remember last year we hit a point where 60% of all DC Comics were considered dead titles walking outside the top 100, which is horrifying. And now they've actually exceeded that in June of 2024, to where it was 65%. Essentially 2 out of every 3 DC comic books are not moving the needle. Nobody's paying attention. People aren't buying them at the volume that would be necessary. Basically, all these titles should be canceled. And there's some good books on there. Unfortunately, they've been kind of taken down with this. And you could say, well, Wes, we've had the rise of the Energon universe. We've got an entire Spawn universe out there. We've got a Ghost Machine rising up. There's more competition. There is more competition, certainly. But DC are also producing less comic books than they have in recent memory, other than, right directly out of the pandemic. It's not like they're putting out a whole lot of titles, but there's just almost no interest in them. And we're seeing it even with titles like Batman and Absolute Power. They're certainly not outside the top 100, but the interest in them really just isn't there anymore. And we know that there is going to be a change for DC Comics very soon. We've got All In with a massive number of creative team changes on the mainline titles like Action and Detectives and Batman and Robin and Green Arrow and a few other books out there, Catwoman, Harley Quinn, and we're also getting the introduction to the Absolute Universe. So this stuff isn't going to stay constant. These numbers will greatly improve when it hits October, because there will be new interest generated in DC Comics. But this, time starting with 5G and then to Future State and then to Dawn of DC has just been this succubus that destroyed, a lot of the interest in DC Comics and drove a lot of people away. And it's been very destructive. Hopefully they can nail it with All In, especially the Absolute Universe. But I've actually heard a lot of the concepts behind those. And I think DC Comics fans, generally speaking, are going to hate them. And within 9 months, will outright reject these titles, especially stuff like Batman and Superman, the more important titles. So not looking good for DC. There's just something wrong with it. Now let's talk about these terrifying numbers and some of the examples of why this kind of stuff is happening. You're not really going to believe this stuff. These numbers are generated and derived from the Comic Hub application that comic book stores can use. It's only 140 stores, but it's a good sample size. It does give you a very good idea what the trends are, what's hot, what's not, and what's failing in popularity. In DC, overwhelmingly, is not popular right now. DC Comics had 33 dead titles walking out of 51 new comics in June 2024. This means 65% of DC Comics new titles in June were dead titles walking. This was up from 26 dead titles walking that DC had in May, which comprised 60% of DC's new titles. Honestly, I didn't know it would be possible for DC Comics to hit an all-new rock bottom number in this category. Year-over-year numbers were up as DC Comics had 23 dead titles walking in June 2023. This comprised 50% of DC new titles in June 2023. Numbers were also up from 2 years ago when DC had 17 dead titles walking in June of 2022. That comprised 39% of DC's new titles in June of the year 2022. Compared to Marvel, Marvel had 30 dead titles walking out of their 88 new comics in June of 2024. 34% of Marvel Comics new titles in June were dead titles walking. A striking difference. Marvel are producing 37 more comic books, and yet their dead titles walking list was lower than DC Comics. And by percentage, it was 30% lower than DC Comics. This is just staggering numbers when you look at this. And the people that have just kind of walked away from DC have just driven off so many of their readers. And you hope that maybe something like an Absolute power would change the tide, but that is not happening. And you're even seeing it with titles like Batman. Batman is a perennial top 3 selling comic book. No matter who you put on it, no matter what happens, Batman is a top 3 selling comic book. It's not anymore. It's not even a top 5 selling comic book. It's a top 10 selling comic book. And I'm kind of under the impression now, I've been wavering. I was like, what are the Batman sales? Because we don't know the actual numbers, but, just based on the trajectory and the trend that we're seeing, and what I think a high level ongoing series can do, about 100,000 at the very best right now. Where do I think Batman is? And I've got a staggering suspicion that it's actually under 70,000 now. And you remember, during the end state of Tom King's Batman run, when he really pissed people off with Batman 50, The Not Wedding, and then he went into that Nightmares arc, which was just an abomination. And people had finally said, I've had enough. I'm not supporting Batman anymore under Tom King. And eventually they fired him. They removed him from the title early. I think it dipped down to about 72. And it looked like it was trending to go under 70, but then City of Bane and the exit of Tom King kind of renewed interest, and it kind of creeped back over 80 before he left the title. Then it springed up to about 130 when James Tynion took over. Unfortunately, we don't have much sales data after that, so it certainly had rebounded and was doing very, very well under James Tynion. He didn't last very long. Obviously, he went to Substack. But I think we might be under Tom King numbers here, and that's what got Tom King fired. But for some reason, in all the change that they did with DC All In, they didn't remove Chip Zdarsky from the Batman title, despite him doing the Gotham War story and dragging out the Zurin R failsafe stuff for far too long and sending Batman off to like some alternate pocket universe that nobody really liked and taking everything away from him and having him do what he did to Jason Todd. Nobody's really hot on that Batman title, yet he's still there. I don't get it. And here's further kind of illustration of that. Recently, we had Uncanny X-Men #1 from Gail Simone debuted the same week as we got a Batman title, and Absolute Power #2. Look at this. Also derived from the Comic Hub data, we see that Uncanny X-Men being the baseline and that ratio being 100, Batman 151 sold 42.4% of the amount of titles to customers. These aren't orders from shops. These are sales to customers of what Uncanny X-Men #1 did. Absolute Power #2 actually did worse at just over 41%. This is a terrifying example of just how bad things have gotten at DC Comics should Uncanny X-Men #1 outsell a regular Batman title. 100% abso-freaking-lutely. Uncanny X-Men #1 is a legacy title unto itself that has been the best-selling title in comic books for years upon years. It isn't right now, but it has been. And when you relaunch a title like that with a #1 and you get a lot of variant covers, it should be the #1 title. Nothing wrong with that. But Batman moving just over 40% to customers of what Uncanny X-Men #1 did is really, really shocking stuff. Like, do we believe that Uncanny X-Men #1 sold or shipped like 200,000 copies to customers? Because judging by those numbers, and those aren't finite data, but it generally speaking should give us an idea how popular it is in comparison to Uncanny X-Men #1, it would need to for Batman to come in, at like an 80,000, which would be a low number for Batman. I don't think that Uncanny X-Men #1 moved that kind of volume. I think it did very, very well, but I don't think it did 200,000. I think if it did 200,000, Marvel Comics would have had a press release. I think it was probably more in the line of 160, maybe 180, something like that. A very, very, very good, very strong number as we're rebooting the X-Men universe. And Batman should be performing much better if it was healthy than 40%. It should be well over 50%. And then you got Absolute Power on top of that. And we kind of knew it was a dud coming out of the gate, although there was better word of mouth than anticipated. I'm not supporting it because it's Mark Waid, and fuck that guy. I'm not going to support any of his books. But people, generally speaking, were saying, well, this is kind of good, but it's not moving the needle. People aren't interested, even on issue #2. After strong word of mouth, the interest still isn't there, and this is bad juju. I do think that the Absolute Universe will garner headlines and interest because it's something different, but it's also coming out and being launched out of Absolute Power. and all the stuff and the status quo change in the new universe that we're going to be exploring in All In is set up and delivered in the finale, as far as I know, and the way I understand it, of Absolute Power. And nobody's reading it. They're treating it as if it's another throwaway event by DC Comics rather than this enormous line-wide event that's super duper impactful. That's bad news. DC can't even get people interested when they're changing stuff, and we're getting ready for all these creative changes. And you wonder, well, why does all this stuff happen? It's a lack of talent. They are doing less titles, which you would think would mean there would be better pound for pound quality in there because, we would have gotten rid of the fat. We would have gotten rid of the bad writers. That's not what they did. They just kind of doubled down on the bad writers and gave them more gigs and kind of kicked out the good people that they had. Jeremy Adams, for reasons unknown, can't get more than one book at a time. I don't get it. Robert Venditti is not writing for DC Comics really anymore. Why is that happening? Yes, for a while, Josh Williamson was writing everything, but he's really the only kind of popular writer that they were giving a lot of projects to. And now Tom King is coming back, and he's going to be doing more and more stuff. And if he's not on Batman and Wonder Woman or a mainstream character, nobody cares about that stuff. You'll look at that list that I had earlier. The Penguin's on it. It's a Tom King book because no one fucking cares. Unless he's on a really big title, there's really no interest in Tom King at all. But they keep hiring writers that don't move the needle, that don't get anyone excited, and put them on projects, and then they fail constantly. A great example, they do the Tinny Howard Worst Writer of the Month Award or whatever at Comic Book Revolution, where they go through and they say, hey, who had the most dead titles walking? Who's the worst performing writer? And they have a rack and stack type of thing that they do there. And of course, Tinny Howard was in the running because she's still on Catwoman and Harley Quinn. But here's a great example. Guess who won it? Josie Campbell, DC Comics writer. Josie Campbell had 4 comics in My Adventures with Superman #1 at the number 124 spot, Shazam number 12 at the number 157 spot. Shazam 13 was unranked, and My Adventures with Superman #2 was also unranked. It is phenomenal that just 4 issues into Campbell's run, she has managed to drive this title into the ground and have it unranked. Shazam was a title that consistently sold between the top 50 and top 75 under Mark Waid. It's also jaw-dropping that Campbell could make My Adventures with Superman unranked by just the second issue. Debuting a Superman book outside the top 100 is an accomplishment unto itself. Now, it's a little bit notorious. It's not something to be proud of, but it's something very, very hard to do, and Josie Campbell managed to do that. Yet they keep giving this person projects, and I understand she's like the showrunner or the writer or lead writer or whatever for My Adventures with Superman. And if DC Comics were really hot and a lot of people were interested in it, I would say a My Adventures with Superman companion comic book isn't the worst idea in the world, but DC's not hot. My Adventures with Superman, the cartoon, isn't driving people into comic book shops, and it was just a waste of time. It's already out of the top 200. It's not even ranked anymore. And that's shocking stuff. But the Shazam drop is flabbergasting because Josie Campbell had already done like the Champion of Shazam or whatever it was, the Mary Marvel book, and it didn't sell. There was already empirical data that Josie Campbell on a Shazam related title had zero interest from comic book readers, yet she's the one that replaced Mark Waid on Shazam. Why isn't Robert Venditti on Shazam? Why isn't Jeremy Adams on Shazam? Why didn't we go get Tom Waltz? Why didn't we get Ryan Parent? Why isn't G. Willow Wilson on Shazam? All writers that have a better audience and a better history of actually selling comic books that would actually do the character justice. DC keep doubling and tripling down on these terrible writers and expect a different result. They are character killers. They are line destroyers. Colin Kelly on Jackson Lanzing on anything moves the needle in the wrong direction. Stephanie Phillips, Teenie Howard, Cy Spurrier destroyed sales on Flash. Flash should not be outside of the top 100. Flash should be a perennial top 20 selling book, but under Cy Spurrier, he's destroyed it after Jeremy Adams had kind of fixed the book and had sales trending in the right direction and was a top 50 selling book again. And they just continuously destroy themselves. And people are liking, I guess, Cy Spurrier on Constantine. But guess what? It's not selling well because it's Cy Spurrier and he doesn't have a following. And he's had enough bad stuff out there that people just tune out when they see his name on the cover. Like, yeah, it's Cy Spurrier. It's Stephanie Phillips. It's Colin Kelly and Jackson Lanzing. It's Matt fucking Rosenberg. Why should I pay attention to this? And they have just taken so many of Marvel Comics' sloppy second failures and put them into positions that should be going to up-and-coming talent that DC Comics themselves are trying to create. And they deserve what they get. This is what happens when you hire untalented people and continuously promote them. Interest in your product dies, and that's what's happened to DC. Hopefully things do turn around for the much better, obviously, in October with All In and the Absolute Universe, but they need change now. And obviously comic book retailers are taking the brunt of this. They expect, high-selling, high-quality DC Comics, and there are a couple of books out there, but for the most part, it's all dried up. But also DC did have a unique advantage over Marvel and Image and basically all the other publishers out there. They had their own release day. They had Tuesday to themselves, and they've decided to give it up because there certainly were comic book retailers out there that said it wasn't worth it. I don't want to put out new books on Tuesday and Wednesday. I'm going to wait, and I'm only going to put my books out on Wednesday. DC fans be damned. But some people were taking advantage of that, and one comic book retailer in particular is not happy about that. That would be Rod Lombardi, who kind of talked about that in his latest newsletter on Bleeding Cool, but then in a more recent one that came out this week, reiterated it after the change happened at DC Comics. As a store owner, I try to get people to come into my store. We have sales and auctions, and having a second release day in the week helped. Then, due to no input from me and many other comic stores, DC stopped having a street day of Tuesday and moved back to Wednesday. I do not understand why DC went and did this. DC had new comics on Tuesday available just for them. There was no new release competition from other publishers, so naturally they had an advantage. DC threw that away. And that is the story of DC Comics for the last 10 years. Every time they have something working for them or something that might work to their advantage, they throw it away and they put themselves in the back of the line so far behind Marvel, it's not even funny. Renewed interest while Marvel was destroying their characters by going back to the best versions of them in Rebirth. What do? Let's blow it up and make it a Batman-centric dark universe after, Dark Knight's Metal destroyed everything, still feeling the ramifications from that. Superman is the heart and soul of the DC universe. Jeff Johns got that. That's why when you go and read Doomsday Clock, which unfortunately is no longer canon, it was reiterating that Superman truly is the heart and soul of the universe. They gave it all away because they had an event that was somewhat popular. Turns out that style and that tone don't work for DC Comics, long term. They certainly don't work with DC Comics fans. They decided to go right down that same path that Marvel Comics were doing. They've destroyed all their characters. They've got so many different versions of their heroes that it's not even fun to see the families anymore. And every time DC has something going, they just kind of give it away. I don't understand their mentality. They have a loser mentality. What is it that Marvel is doing that we can do it worse? That's what we're going to do here. And we'll see what happens, because their idea for Absolute Universe in comparison to Marvel's idea for Ultimate Universe absolutely sucks. You guys are going to see, mark my words, when you see this stuff and this new version of Batman and Superman, you're going to fucking hate it, especially if you're a DC fan and you're a Superman purist and a Batman purist. These ideas are terrible. There will be renewed interest. The sales will certainly skyrocket in October because they literally can't get any lower. But I'm telling you, within 9 months, people are going to walk away. They need to get back to the heart of the universe. They need to get back to the heart of the characters. Screw all these terrible writers. Go out there and find the people that love these characters the most, that like superheroes, and want to show them at their very best, not what they could be at their very worst, which is basically this weird sick fetish that most of DC writers have these days, and certainly Marvel as well. But Marvel just seems to have a security blanket that DC Comics don't. But there you go. Terrifying new lows for DC Comics sales. You don't think you can actually get down to 2 out of every 3 books are failing at DC Comics, but that's where we are. Hopefully they'll be able to turn around and we actually get some quality with All In. I'm not crossing my fingers. I'm very cynical, but I will check it all out. And hopefully some of it's good, because I want to talk to you guys about that as well. If you appreciate what I'm doing here on Thinking Critical YouTube and you like the mission that I'm going out there providing some real honest assessments on what's going on with comic books, trying to help you find the best comic books while avoid the worst comic books and all that stuff, and you would like to support me and that mission, I do invite you to come over and visit me on Thinking Critical Patreon, where we have lots and lots of extra bonus content in the form of podcasts, which is lots of fun with all of your favorite guests. If you haven't checked out the Patreon, we got 3 different tiers there. There's a link in the video description. I hope to see you there very soon.